Happy 2 o'clock, everyone. And boys and girls, thank you for joining me today for another exciting chess lesson. I am your instructor, Coach Daniel Brennan, also affectionately known as Grandmaster Awesome. Let me start out by saying that I miss you guys. I hope you're doing well, and I'm very happy to see some familiar faces tuning in. Hello, chess minions. The title of my lesson today is The 5 Types of Attacks in Chess. So by the end of our time together, I want you to know the names of the 5 different types of attacks in chess. I want you to know how to recognize each of them, and I want you to start using these ideas in your own chess games. Let's begin with a very basic question. Why does attacking matter? The answer is very simple. Attacking is important because it is impossible to win a game of chess unless you attack your opponent. So the more you learn about attacking, the more chess games you're going to win. The first type of attack is called a simple attack. A simple attack is when one piece looks at one enemy piece. As you can see, there are no other pieces helping the bishop attack the pawn. Simple attacks are very easy to do, and they're extremely common. So here, white to move, bishop captures pawn. Simple attack. The second type of attack is called a group attack. A group attack happens when there is more than one simple attack. Here, 3 white pieces attack the black bishop on e5. The queen attacks the bishop, the rook attacks the bishop, and white's knight attacks the bishop. White's pieces are working together as a group. A group attack is more effective than a simple attack. So just remember, that's a group attack. The third type of attack is called a square attack. Square attacks occur when attacking a square is more important than attacking a piece. Here, the rook is threatening to move to the e8 square. If it goes there, white will win the game because the position will be a checkmate. However, if we put a knight on the e8 square, you will notice that the attack against the e8 square, placing checkmate, is more important than winning the knight. This is why this would be considered a square attack and not a simple attack. So the rook sees the knight, but the real point of the move is that we have checkmate. That's a lot more important than winning a piece. So that's a square attack. The fourth type of attack is called a counterattack. Here is a position very similar to our square attack diagram. Black decided to move their knight to the g5 square, making a simple attack on white's queen. But instead of running to safety with the queen, white played a counter-attacking move, rook to e1. So notice we have a square attack on the e8 square with the threat of checkmate, and that's more important than black's threat of capturing white's queen. If black takes white's queen, he loses immediately. This means that black cannot capture the queen, and he's got to do something else. Just remember that your queen as white is still in danger. So if black does something to remove the threat of checkmate, you're probably still going to have to save your queen. So that's a counterattack. The fifth type of attack is called tactics. We're not going to cover tactics deeply today because they're going to get special attention in future lessons. Today, I only want to introduce you to the word. A tactic is a theme that your opponent overlooked that leads to a major change in the game. Tactics are patterns, and there are dozens of them. I'll quickly show you just a few from this position. So white to move, he plays knight to e5. The knight creates a double attack tactic against black's queen and the f7 square. Attacking f7 here actually leads to a checkmate, so black must now choose between losing either his queen or his king. I'll show you what I mean. Black does not sense the danger to his king, so he moves the queen to safety at b6 and gives us an example of a pin tactic. White's rook on e3 is frozen. The rook can't move because then the black queen would see white's king at g1. The pinned rook is also unguarded, meaning that black is threatening to capture it for free. White, though, finds a counterattack that is more powerful than black's threat to capture his rook on e3. The knight also creates a fork tactic, checking the king and threatening the rook on d8. A fork tactic occurs when one piece threatens two enemy pieces at the same time. King g8 is forced from black. Now white's knight can move anywhere, and the black king will be in check from white's queen. This is called a discover check tactic. White's knight could capture the rook on d8, but instead, he finds something even better. White recognizes a powerful tactic called a double check. Two pieces check the enemy king at the same time, meaning that the king is forced to move. If black moves his king to f8, he is checkmated immediately by queen to f7. Therefore, his only reasonable attempt is to move to h8. Moving the king to h8 still won't stop checkmate, though. The knight on h6 guards the queen at g8, and black is now forced to capture white's queen with his rook. The problem is that white now wins the game with yet another tactic called a smothered mate. The knight jumps to f7, and black's king is smothered by his own rook and pawns. He can't move to safety, and he is in checkmate. Tactics are different patterns that you will see repeatedly in games of chess. Do not worry if they seem confusing. That is okay. Today, I only need you to remember the word, and that they are one of the 5 types of attacks. At this time, future chess masters, I'll invite you to click the raise hand button if you would like to ask me a question about the 5 types of attacks in chess.
Can you show me when the knight check the queen attacking the king, check the king and the knight guarded it?
Yes, so I think you are referring to this move. This one?
Yeah, so why can't the pawn near, why can't the pawn near the rook but diagonally, can it kill it?
G7.
So are you asking if one of the pawns could get rid of the queen?
Above the queen. That's diagonal from the knight.
Okay, so pawns are the only piece in chess that are not allowed to move backwards. If pawns could move backwards, that would be a fantastic move, right? We would just use the pawn at h7 to move backwards and take the queen. But black's pawns can only go forward, right? So the queen is behind the pawns and is immune on attack.
I'm saying that can the pawn add in front of the queen, and it's diagonal from the knight, can it kill it while it's diagonal from it?
Oh, okay, so in this position, the king is in check, right? You see that the king on h8 is in check from the queen. If black tried to capture this knight, it would not get rid of check, right? If black took the knight, his king would still be in danger from the queen. So remember, when you are in check, you have to find a move that gets you out of check. And there are 3 ways to do that. You can either capture the piece that's checking you, you can block by putting a piece in between the check and your king, or you can run away, but you've got to get out of check. So taking the knight won't solve that problem. So black's not allowed to do that here.
I did have a question.
Okay.
I don't understand like the fifth one, the fifth tactics. All I got from it was different ways to attack.
Well, so interestingly, Noah, that's really all I want you to get out of it today, because tactics, it's a word that has so many meanings in chess. It applies to a lot of different ideas and recurring patterns. So all you need to know is that tactics are one of the 5 types of attacks in chess. You will cover tactics extensively in later lessons. You'll get sick of tactics by the time we are finished teaching you. So just know one of the 5 types of attacks are tactics.
My question was, is there like more than 5 ways? Like more than 5 attacks? Is there actually more?
You know, that's a tough question to answer, and I'm not positive either way. My guess would be that there are a lot of different ways that you could organize types of attacks. We've organized them in accordance with a book written by Ryan Velez that I think very sensibly categorizes the types of attacks into 5 categories. And I think that it covers everything. I think that it's a reasonable attempt to explain all of the possible attacking moves. And so that's how I'm teaching it to you, is in a way that breaks down a complicated subject into the most sensible, simplistic form that we can think of to do it. So I think if you learn the 5 types of attacks, it will include every possible attack in some way. So that would be my guess.
Okay.
That I wasn't here in the lesson when you explained the first law. I mean, the first rule.
Okay. Well, so good news for you, sir. The first one is the easiest one. So we'll just glance at it. It's called a simple attack. And all it means is that one piece looks at one enemy piece. So here, white's got a bishop at b2. It looks at the pawn on e5. It can take it, right? That's a simple attack. One piece threatening one enemy piece. That's it. Simple attack.
Okay. Can you go back to the other position?
Sure. So the one that we were looking at before, here?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Couldn't rook on D8 go to F8? So then
Like
it
this?
would threaten to get the queen, but so then the queen would have to get that. So then the rook on in the corner could capture the queen.
Okay, so let's look at this. So the first thing that I'll say is the move white just made, white's last move, is queen to g8 check. And the check part of it is critical. Remember, when you are in check, your move has to get you out of check. So if black tried to move that rook on d8 to the f8 square, it would actually be an illegal move because he would move the rook to f8, and then one or both players would notice that the king on h8 is still in check from the queen on g8. So whatever black does here has to get himself out of check. And in fact, there's only one possible way to get out of check here, which is by eliminating the queen on g8. So black doesn't really get a choice in terms of what he plays here. He has to play rook takes queen, otherwise he's not escaping check. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep.
Okay, great. So now that we know a little bit more about the 5 types of attacks in chess, I'd like to show you some examples of them from real chess games. Let's start out with the simple attack. You'll recall that simple attack is one piece looking at one enemy piece. And I'm going to go over a game example here that will further put on display some simple attacks for you to see in action. So white starts the game with a very reasonable first move. If you're not sure why this is a good first move, I suggest you go back and watch Coach Ryan's 2 videos about opening principles and attacking the center. Black responds with a questionable move that violates opening principles. Why is it questionable? Well, the pawns both have simple attacks against each other, but it's white's turn. So white simply captures the pawn, and the only way for black to capture the pawn back is with his queen. You might remember from Coach Miami's recent lesson that it's a mistake to bring your queen out early. The big reason is that she can be attacked very easily. Look and see if you can find a way for white to make a simple attack against black's queen. Actually, there are 5 ways. 2 of the ways are very silly. So here's one. Queen to h5 is not a good move. White does make a simple attack against black's queen, but black's queen also has a simple attack against white's queen, and it's black's turn, so black would happily capture white's queen for free. Other possibilities, bishop to c4 has the same problem. Black would simply capture it, and that's good for black. Queen to f3 makes a simple attack on the queen, but black's not afraid of trading his own queen for white's queen because they're worth the same. They are equal pieces, they're both worth 9 points. Even something like queen takes queen is pretty level. It doesn't accomplish much for white. c4 is a good move. The pawn creates a simple attack against the queen. The queen cannot safely take the pawn because white's bishop on f1 protects the pawn. And this means that the queen must move. Coach Ryan recently taught an entire lesson about why you shouldn't move the same piece twice. Let's look at knight to c3. This is the best move. It's even better than pawn to c4. White safely develops a piece with a simple attack on the queen. The benefit is that we have the knight developing to c3 instead of simply moving a pawn to c4. To understand more about why developing pieces is a good idea, check out Coach Ryan's lesson entitled, Develop Your Pieces, Why and How to Do It. In this position, white has only one move that makes a simple attack, and it happens to be a fantastic move. See if you can spot it. With pawn to g4, white makes a simple attack against the black knight. The knight has no safe squares to run to because white's bishop on f4 takes them all away. So this means that no matter what the knight does, if he stays put, if he tries to move to one of the 4 available squares, white is going to capture that knight for free. Here's our last example of a simple attack. White has, by my count, 10 different ways to create a new simple attack against one of the enemy pawns. Now, none of these moves are very good. White does, though, have one excellent move, which makes a simple attack against black's rook on h8. See if you can find it. With bishop to b2, the bishop now sees the rook on h8. And unfortunately for the rook, he's stuck there. He can't move the rook. So black's best try is to maybe move the knight out of the way. The idea being that now at least the rook on a8 can protect the rook at h8. But white is very happy to trade his 3-point bishop for black's 5-point rook. Let's revisit our definition of a group attack. So here we can flash back and see that a group attack happens when there is more than one simple attack. We'll look through another game. So d4, knight f6, c4, everything looks pretty typical. But now we've got pawn to e5. What is going on here? It looks like black is just giving up a pawn for free, so white gladly takes it. As you will soon see, though, black is going to win this pawn back using a group attack. The knight moves to safety and creates the first simple attack against the white pawn. White does not want to lose his pawn, so he defends it. For more information about recognizing threats and how to look for them, watch Coach Miami's recent video on the topic. Black adds a second attack on the pawn at e5, and now this is a group attack. White is able to add a second defender to protect his pawn, and after the moves bishop to b4 check, knight from b to d2 to block check, black has one additional way to add a simple attack into this group attack against the pawn on e5. Look and see if you can find a way for black to add another attacker. Against this group attack, white does not have a way to defend his pawn. The queen is now contributing, and there are 3 attacks against this pawn. With those 3 pieces working together to attack e5, black's going to use this group attack to finally win white's e5 pawn. The group attack has succeeded. So here we've got knight takes, and if white captures, at the very end, black had one more attacker than white had defenders, meaning that at the conclusion, black wins material here. Let's look back at square attacks. You'll remember that the square attack is an attack that is not on a piece, but rather it attacks a specific square. So here the rook was attacking the e8 square with the threat of checkmate. And now we're going to see the square attack in action. So here's a position, and white's pawn on f6 is attacking the g7 square in front of black's king. White realizes that if he can simply get his queen to attack g7 too, that would be checkmate. So for example, it takes 3 moves, but if the queen can swing around and get to g7, that would be checkmate. It turns out that black can't prevent this. So white begins with queen to h4. Black doesn't have anything better to do than move a rook over to the open file and try to create some space for his king, but as you will see, it doesn't help. Queen to h6. Black is now about to be checkmated by the move queen to g7. He only has one way to prevent this. How must he stop the checkmate threat? He has to give up his queen to stop white from winning immediately with queen to g7 checkmate. White wins black's queen because his square attack against g7 was so powerful. The square attack was the only possible because black's castled position was not safe to begin with. To better understand why it wasn't safe, please revisit my video about castling, the greatest move in chess. Remember that a counterattack is when you attack and defend simultaneously. We will look at an opening that features several counterattacking moves. So we'll flip through here at a pretty brisk pace. As you can see, everything's pretty normal. And now white pushes a pawn in the center, threatening black's knight. Instead of running away, though, black finds a counterattack. Black defends his knight on f6 by making a bigger threat against white's queen. Since white's queen is more valuable than black's knight on f6, white will not play e takes f6, because then he would lose his queen. So instead, black is going to save his knight. Or white's going to save the queen by going to b3 rather. And now that the queen is safe, the threat to take the knight on f6 is very real. And so the knight has to move away to safety, and he goes to d7. After the moves h4, c5, we'll flip through a couple. Now, white is trying to capture the pawns that are providing shelter for black's king. Black captures on d4 and is now threatening white's knight on c3. He'll take it on the next turn, or so he thinks. White realizes that his attack against black's king is much more important than the attack against the knight on c3. If black now takes the knight, he's going to be checkmated by a counterattack. So black takes the knight, and here's what happens. Queen takes e6, check, and if the king simply moves to h8, this is a checkmate. And similarly, if black blocks with the rook, we have the same idea. The queen takes the rook, the king must move, and white achieves checkmate. So instead of taking the knight, black finds a move that guards against checkmate because it protects the e6 square, and he also attacks white's queen. Even though white's queen is threatened, he can still put the black king in check because black must save his king. The king has to go to h8, and now white's queen is in danger on b3. It makes sense to move her to safety. White, however, finds an even better move. You guessed it, it's a counterattack. Now, if black captures white's queen, white wins the game with a cute little move, knight to g6, checkmate. As mentioned, the fifth type of attack in chess is called tactics. Half of your chess career will be spent learning all about tactics. They exist in almost every possible chess position. Providing more examples of specific tactics is well beyond the scope of what we're learning today. Just remember, tactics are a type of attack. Once again, I will invite you to click the raise hand button if you have any general or specific questions about what we've learned.
All right. And I want to remind players that we're about half an hour in. We've finished up with our main lesson that talks about attacks. We're now taking questions. If you need to leave, that is fine. If you'd like to stick around and ask a question, that's also okay. Many players' questions might be interesting and you can learn something from them as well. So feel free, even if you don't have a question, to stick around and listen. If you have a chess story or something else you want to share, that's also fine. But we'll go ahead and start taking last questions. We'll be here for as long as you have questions. We'll be here to answer them.
For those of you who are cutting out early, I've spelled out by using only chess pieces, just for you.
Can you go to the counterattack where the knight checkmates?
Sure, let's see. So you're looking at this position?
Yeah, when the knight checkmates.
Okay, so here we're saying if black doesn't realize that his king is in danger and he captures the knight on c3, we've got knight to g6 checkmate.
How is that a checkmate, though?
Okay, so the first word of checkmate is check. You always need to have check. So here, black's king is in check, courtesy of the knight. So the first thing we have to consider is whether or not black can eliminate this knight by capturing it. And the answer is no. This means that he's got to either block check or run away. Unfortunately for black, you can't block a knight check because the knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So his only possible reply is to move the king. And there are two squares that would be candidates. The bishop blocks the g7 square, so that's not a possibility. The king cannot slide over to g8 because white's pawn takes that square away with a simple attack. So the only possibility to prevent this from being a checkmate would be, can black simply capture this pawn on h7? And the answer is no, because the rook protects the pawn. So we have exhausted all of black's possibilities, meaning that there are no good alternatives, and he is in checkmate.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
It looks like no one else had any other questions or stories they wanted to share, but that means we are pretty much finished up. Although I will say this, if you do learn something and you can teach it to someone else, that is often the best way to remember it. Because once you've taught something, it's a lot easier to remember. At least it is for me. Otherwise, I think we are finished up with our lesson for today and all our questions.
All right. Beautiful. Well, wonderful seeing you all, and thank you for tuning in.
All right. Our next lesson will be tomorrow, Thursday at 4. We'll be going over all the chess defenses now that we've talked about attacks. And of course, on Friday, we will have our group game session. So anyone wants to join in on Lead Chess and play against other students, that'll be on Friday. We had about 75 players last week. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.